After today, which is December 26th, 2020, there's only 5 days left of this year. This year is about to end, and I thought that it would be a good idea to make a video series summarizing all the events that have taken place in the past year. Let me tell you, this year has been a very eventful year, probably the most eventful year of my life, and for all the wrong reasons, but even in this part alone, which is only the first 2 months of 2020 before things even got that chaotic, there were already a lot of events that took place in this time frame. Now, I looked through all the events that took place, all the major events that took place throughout these 2 months, and I had to leave out a lot of them because of how much happened, but even then, I still have a lot of things to talk about in this part of the video series. So, like I said in my previous video, this portion of the year goes from January 1, 2020 to March 10th, 2020. So everything in this video will be talking about the events that took place in that time frame, January 1 of this year to March 10th of this year. So let's start with the beginning of this year. So it's the new year, early January 2020. The first year of 2020 is the first year of the new decade. We were all hyped for this year, but here's the thing that almost none of us knew when this year began, that there was this novel new virus called, well, at the time it wasn't called that, but now we call it COVID-19, and it was starting to spread through China. It was a very new virus. It had started spreading at the very end of 2019 to people, and it was discovered in like the last few days of 2019, I believe. At the very end of 2019, this virus was discovered, and at the time there's no name for this virus. It was just called the Chinese coronavirus for a while, but in early January, basically, this virus started spreading throughout China at first, throughout Wuhan to be specific, the city of Wuhan in the Hubei province. That's where this virus first started spreading. So that was taking place in early January. Also in early January were the Australia wildfires. So these were wildfires taking place in Australia, and they were pretty destructive, and that was unfortunate. So this was not in the United States. I'm gonna, for the most part, be talking about things that happened in the United States. There's too many events worldwide to mention all of them, so I'm mostly gonna stick to the United States. But next we have January 2nd, 2020. There were two major events on this date. So the first major event was the killing of Soleimani in Baghdad. He was assassinated, and this was a very controversial killing. A lot of people thought that Trump did not, he should have sought out congressional approval before doing that. A lot of people were not happy with that, and people in Iraq were not happy with that. Obviously, one of the top generals of that country was killed, so a lot of people were obviously mad about that. So this was only day 2 of 2020, just the second day of this year, and we already had a crazy event like this happen. And I honestly think that it was just foreshadowing. It was just a foreshadowing of what was to come this year, all the chaos that would ensue throughout this year. I think that was the beginning of it. That was our first glimpse of the kind of chaos we would see. And for the next few days and even few weeks after that event, that was talked about a lot by the media, and it was a very important issue in terms of foreign policy. That was like one of the most important foreign policy issues throughout January, that killing. But on January 2nd, 2020, the other major event that took place was the Democratic candidate Julian Castro dropped out of the 2020 Democratic primaries. So at the start of this year, we had 15 candidates in the primaries still, but after Castro dropped out, we were down to 14. So I think that this first part of the year, this first section of the year, January 1, 2020 to March 10, 2020, there are three major events that took place in this time frame. One, impeachment, the impeachment trials of Donald Trump in the Senate. Two, the Democratic primaries. These mainly took place in February, but the build up to them was in January. And three, COVID 19. At the time, most people in the United States didn't think much of it except that it was spreading in China, but most people in the United States didn't think it would actually come to their country, and same with other countries. At the time, it was mostly only in China, but as we know now, it obviously spread across the entire world. But that's for the future videos for the series. So these are the three major topics, and most of the events that I'll be talking about fall into one of these three categories. So, unrelated to any of those categories, however, on January 9th of this year, January 9th, 2020, this is when the Brexit decision was finalized. So, a few years ago, it was voted in the United Kingdom. By a majority vote, people in the United Kingdom voted that they wanted to leave the European Union. This was done a few years ago, but the decision wasn't actually finalized until January of this year. So by the end of January, the United Kingdom had officially left the European Union. So that took place on January 9th, the vote to finalize that decision. That doesn't really involve the United States, but I still thought that it was a pretty important thing to mention. So, throughout January, besides Julian Castro, three other Democratic candidates dropped out. So, at the start of the month, there were 15 candidates still running, but at the end of the month, there were only 11 candidates left. So, on January 10th, Marianne Williamson dropped out. On January 13th, Cory Booker dropped out. And at the very end of the month, on January 31st, 2020, John Delaney dropped out. And I'm going to tell you, I'm going to be honest with you guys, none of those candidates had any chance of winning the primaries, so it's not surprising that they all dropped out before the primaries began. But in the month of January, there was one last Democratic debate before the actual primaries took place. So this was the last chance for all the Democratic candidates, at least the ones who got to participate in this debate. A few of the candidates did not get to participate, like Andrew Yang and Tulsi Gabbard, for example. But this was the last chance for the candidates to tell voters, especially in Iowa, why they should vote for them before the actual Iowa caucus began. The Iowa caucus was the first statewide election for the Democratic primaries that took place on February 3rd, 2020, which we're going to get to in a second, because that was a pretty interesting scenario. Getting back to COVID 19, though, January 20th, 2020, this is a very important date. This is when the first COVID 19 case popped up in the United States. It popped up in Washington State, to be exact. Now, coincidentally, January 20th, 2020 was the 3 year anniversary of Donald Trump first being inaugurated as President of the United States. Now, at the time, we didn't know this, but now we know after the election, after the 2020 election, now that that's over, we know that that was exactly 1 year before Joe Biden's inauguration that will take place in a little under a month from now on January 20th, 2021. So at the time, I was thinking Donald Trump either has 1 year left or 5 years left. And I'm going to be honest, I thought he had 5 years left at the time. Donald Trump's re election chances were looking really good at the start of 2020. And I think that's a pretty important thing to mention. At the start of 2020, it looked like he had like an 80% chance of getting reelected. The economy was doing well, but here's the thing. COVID, I honestly think, is the reason why Donald Trump lost this election. I honestly think that if COVID did not exist, Donald Trump would have definitely won a second term as president. So that's why I find it very ironic the fact that the first COVID 19 case in the United States popped up on January 20th, that specific date. The very thing that ruined his chance at re election popped up exactly a year before Joe Biden's inauguration. That's what I found funny because at the time, I thought that Trump easily had 5 more years left, but throughout 2020, as COVID 19 got worse and worse, I slowly realized he only had 1 year left. So that took place on January 20th. That's also when the Chinese authorities announced that COVID 19 had actually been spreading quite a lot throughout China, especially in Wuhan. And there had been three documented deaths in total by then in China from COVID 19. One thing that's unrelated to anything I've talked about that I thought it would be interesting to mention, this year was a census year. Every 10 years, the United States does a census to where they figure out how many people live in each state, how many people live in the entire country. That way, they can reapportion congressional districts appropriately. They can assign each state the appropriate amount of congressional districts. So that started on January 21st, 2020. I thought that would be an interesting thing to mention. The next day, on January 22nd, 2020, that's when the Senate impeachment hearings began. So that happened from late January to early February. And as you probably know, Donald Trump easily got acquitted. He did not get kicked out of office, not even close. Only 48 senators voted to kick him out of office, while 52 voted to not kick him out of office. So the only Republican senator to vote to kick him out of office was Mitt Romney, which is a little bit surprising, but not that surprising if you realized how much Mitt Romney did not like Trump. It's not really that much. It's not really that surprising. The day before that impeachment vote was on February 5th, 2020, but Donald Trump's State of the Union address was on February 4th, 2020. So during this whole time frame, the reason why I'm bringing up all these events is it looked like Donald Trump easily had a second term in the bag. It looked like Joe Biden or whoever the Democratic nominee would be. At the time, we didn't know yet because the primaries hadn't finished yet. At the time, it looked like Donald Trump easily had a second term to most people. So that is when COVID 19 also started spreading in the United States. And throughout February, there weren't many cases, but it got a lot worse in March, which we're going to get to. So, February 3rd was the Iowa caucus. I said we were going to get to this. This was a really interesting scenario. So February 3rd is when people in Iowa actually casted their votes, but here's the thing. None of the results came in on February 3rd for some reason. There was some sort of glitch or some sort of error with the software. For some reason the results weren't coming through on the night of the Iowa caucus. But instead we had to wait a few extra days for the results to come in. And by the time the results actually came in, it looked very close between Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg. They essentially tied. They got the same number of delegates. I think they both got 9 delegates. So it didn't really matter, but I think in the end Pete Buttigieg technically won by a very, very small margin, but didn't really matter much. A few days later, on February 11th, 2020, that was the New Hampshire primary. And in that, Bernie Sanders narrowly won that. And on that night also, Andrew Yang dropped out and Michael Bennet dropped out. Both of them did pretty badly in the New Hampshire primary, so it makes sense that they drop out then. The day after, on February 12th, that morning, Deval Patrick also dropped out, in fact. He did also really badly in the New Hampshire primary, so that would make sense. But this is also right around when the COVID-19 death toll passed the death toll for SARS, the virus that spread back in 2003 mostly, in China mainly. But that happened on February 9th, 2020, when the COVID death toll surpassed the SARS death toll. And most of these deaths were in China. In fact, I think they all were in China. But that I found pretty interesting. Yeah, I think a few of the deaths were outside of China, but like most of them were in China at the time because that's where the virus was mostly spreading. So after the New Hampshire primary, there was another debate on February 19th. It was right around here when it looked like Bernie Sanders and Michael Bloomberg each had a really good shot at the nomination, and Joe Biden had a bad chance of winning. Joe Biden got fourth in the Iowa caucus, fifth in the New Hampshire primary, while Bernie Sanders got second by a narrow margin in Iowa, first in New Hampshire, and he also swept the Nevada primary on February 2nd, 22nd, by a large margin, and that Joe Biden got second. By then, Michael Bloomberg hadn't even technically entered any of the primaries yet, but he had spent so much money in ad revenue, in advertisements that it looked like he had a really good chance of winning, and his poll numbers were skyrocketing at the time. At one point, he was basically tied with Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden in the polls, so it looked like he had a serious shot at the nomination, but that all changed with the South Carolina primary. Both Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden's chances of winning the nomination went down the drain, starting with the South Carolina primary on February 29th when Joe Biden swept it completely. Joe Biden got almost half of all the votes casted in South Carolina, and Bernie Sanders got second place, I believe, but even then he didn't do that well. Michael Bloomberg did pretty terribly, and that was the beginning of the end for him. And that night, Tom Steyer also dropped out. It was also this day, coincidentally, that the first COVID-19 death was documented in the United States. I think the first actual death was a few weeks earlier, but at the time they didn't know it was a COVID-19 death because nothing was known about this virus. So essentially, Joe Biden made the comeback starting on February 29th. The day after, on March 1st, Pete Buttigieg dropped out. The day after that, March 2nd, Amy Klobuchar dropped out. And that night itself, both of them, along with Beto O'Rourke, endorsed Joe Biden at a rally in Dallas. So it would make sense that most of those voters went straight to Joe Biden, and that is the reason why the next day, on March 3rd, 2020, Joe Biden won Super Tuesday. And because of that, Bernie Sanders didn't do so well. Michael Bloomberg did not do well at all. The next day, on March 4th, 2020, Michael Bloomberg dropped out and endorsed Biden. So Biden got even more support after that. And then the day after that, Elizabeth Warren dropped out on March 5th, 2020, but she did not endorse anyone. So at the time, it looked like Joe Biden had a much better chance of winning the nomination, but it wasn't over yet. On March 8th, 2020, two major endorsements took place. Kamala Harris, who was now going to be the vice president, at the time she endorsed Joe Biden, and Jesse Jackson, a Democratic candidate who ran for president back in the 1980s, endorsed Bernie Sanders. So these were two major endorsements, but 2 days later, on March 10th, 2020, this is the last day of the time frame we're covering, Joe Biden swept Super Tuesday 2, as I call it, because there were like six primaries on this date. Joe Biden won five of those six. And the reason why is because of all the endorsements that I just listed. And it was that night that it was basically most people realized that Joe Biden would end up winning the nomination. And that's why I end this portion of the year off at March 10th. Because of this fact, Joe Biden basically clinched the nomination on March 10th. Not officially, but unofficially, he did so. So, overall, I think that this portion of the year was just a taste of what 2020 would bring us. The virus started spreading in this time of the year, but it was not in the United States. It was only in China, so us Americans didn't realize how bad it would really become. And by the start of March, there were only 100 cases in the US, but by March 10th, there were already 1,000. Early March is when it started to spiral out of control. It got way worse in the rest of March. We're going to talk about that in tomorrow's video. But I believe that this part of the year set the stage for the rest of the year. with COVID-19, Joe Biden essentially winning the nomination, and Donald Trump getting acquitted in the Senate.